This image took roughly 2 hours to paint, and in this video I'll show you all the main steps, starting with a very simple line work sketch and ending up with the final result. My name is Victor, I work as a concept artist, so let's begin. So let's start by putting your idea on paper. And you want to keep the first pass really simple. Think of the scene as a set of basic volumes in the beginning, like boxes, pyramids, cylinders, and all sorts of extrusions. Block in those simple forms to establish the scale and the placement of your objects. Right now is the time for broader decisions, so nothing final yet. So first I'm laying out the central mass where the castle will sit, sort of a gentle slope for a hill, and a field that stretches toward the foreground. You may want to indicate tree clusters with simple strokes and just suggest some distant hills in the background. The goal is to create a readable structure that you can refine later on. Also, don't forget to gather reference images in the beginning. Look for castle references that show window placement, roof styles, and maybe structural attachments. You may look at how staircases sit against the wall, or ivy or weathering breaks hard geometry. Things like that really helping you get a more believable result in the end. The goal is to make informed decisions so that your end result looks believable. When you feel like your sketch is balanced enough, you can switch to a larger brush and start establishing the sky. You can pick a base hue that sets the overall temperature for the painting. A clean, slightly desaturated blue-purple mix works well for this type of scenario. You can add extra texture if you want to add a little bit of personality, and it also kind of depends on what kind of rendering style you're going for. The choice should absolutely support your vision. The next thing I usually do is work on the background and then move towards the camera. So you can use softer strokes to suggest distance and keep the edges slightly lost to atmosphere. You can place a few clouds. In this case, these are like low clouds near the horizon if it fits the composition. These elements help anchor the castle and prevent the focal point from floating away. It kind of frames it a little bit. And the process at this stage is pretty straightforward for all the rest of the elements in the scene. You can block in the castle with a mid-tone color that feels like stone. You will change it later on, it's not important to nail it right now. This stage also you can keep the palette simple and choose values that separate the building from both sky and the ground. You want to create a nice focal point. By the way, you can use the lasso tool for a quick shape, but sometimes I just prefer to paint with the brush. Now, after the main mass is in place, you can add surrounding trees behind the castle, a few in front of it to suggest a bit more depth, and of course you can establish the crown plane in front of our building and block the field with just a single value for now. Don't get stuck on the exact colors yet. Paint toward the kind of like a plausible endpoint, but know you will adjust the hues, values as the painting progresses. The early stage is all about the shapes you create, the composition, and how everything reads. Also, let's consider a few roof options and pick a hue that will read well against the sky. A deeper blue roof can work, but if the sky is blue as well, be prepared to darken it or maybe desaturate it, just create additional contrast. It's very important to prioritize a clear silhouette, readable edges before settling color relationships. Alright, now think about the cloud placement and how they interact with the castle. Maybe you want to place those clouds in front of the castle, closer to the camera. This might create some subtle shadows and help integrate the structure into the environment, so it might be a cool idea. You can also paint the clouds separately on a couple of layers in order to adjust and move them around. Just don't forget when you're dealing with them to establish like a darker underside, because these are 3D objects, so you want to make sure that the planes that are facing the light are brighter, and then you have like a darker plane that is facing the ground. So let's begin to define the form of the castle by indicating which planes of the castle face away from the main light source. We're going to place a darker value on those faces and gradually build the transitions to lighter planes. You can add smaller structure, chimneys, balconies, and window recesses to break up large flat surfaces. These architectural elements kind of build a visual interest and create some opportunities for cast shadows. So it's really a good idea to periodically use black and white checks just to validate your value structure. Converting your image to grayscale reveals whether the composition reads clearly and whether your focal point holds. If in grayscale everything is confusing, then definitely it's going to be confusing in color as well. Just make sure you are addressing any value issues early on to avoid heavy reworks later in the process. So I had an idea to maybe add some ivy or vegetation on parts of the castle to kind of break this monotony. Because it's a very simple boxy shape, you want to come up with some solution solutions to break things up and make things a bit more interesting for the viewer. So Ivy can soften hard edges and create a more believable lived-in structure, so it might work. You want to keep these shapes that you're adding simple as well and place them where they interact naturally with gravity. You want to think about moisture and things like that if you really want to go into realism. Turn your attention to the foreground and this ground plane. Now, I wanted to make a little bit of a visual statement with it and changing from this yellow kind of boring color to a really cool and saturated lavender field. So let's begin by blocking in a single stripe of flowers and then adjust it with the transform tool to fit into the perspective. So in order to avoid just to manually paint things into perspective, you want to grab a flat texture and adjust it so it follows the receding plane. Alright, now that we have a more or less established ground plane, we can revisit the castle and push darker shadow masses. Let's emphasize the shadows around the windows and under the eaves where the roof casts a shadow. The cast shadows usually anchor the architecture to the ground and clarify the spatial relationships between the elements, so it's a really useful tool. If you want to add extra details, you can work on the roofs with a texture brush to create some material variation. A coarse, maybe like slightly bristled stroke can suggest shingles or like tiles without rendering every detail. You can place darker valleys where the tiles overlap and lighter strokes along ridges that are kind of like exposed to light. Look for odd plane connections and weird value jumps. Simplify the forms that are a bit confusing to read. This is the stage where the painting moves out of the kind of like a rough blocking into a more structured refinement process. You might also take a moment and have a look at the edge quality across the composition. Edges are very important in communicating the forms. Sharp edges bring the elements a bit more forward, soft edges pushes them slightly back. It's not always the case, but oftentimes it is. I would suggest to soften the edges on distant hills and like cloud forms and preserve slightly crisper edges on the castle silhouette and like the immediate foreground objects. I want to figure out this lavender field, so maybe a few lighter strokes that follow the perspective lines will kind of sell the concept without excessive detail. You want to refine the field by suggesting rows and groupings, but not individual flowers. If the castle blends into the background, you might want to adjust the midtones or push more contrast on the roof, or just figure out a way to improve the read of the silhouette. At this point, you also want to introduce some texture information to the walls that suggest stone and weathering. It's always important to have these things for a more believable design. You want to avoid like high frequency noise, so instead opt for like soft directional strokes that imply some surface imperfections. You can add some moss and weathering near the base walls and a little bit on the roof corners. These touches should be subtle and used to break the perfect geometry in a believable way. They also aid in leading the viewer's eye across surfaces. Let's also refine the shadows and some highlights on the stairs and doorway to ensure that the entrance reads as a 3D form. A single well-placed highlight on the upper stair edge can make the step language clear at a glance. As you refine the image, you want to keep an eye on color harmony. Small shifts in hue can unify the scene. If the roofs feel too blue against the sky, desaturate slightly or shift toward the neutral cool, or maybe just darken them. Maybe if the field feels disconnected, then you can tweak its temperature toward the castle or sky until you kind of have some interesting relationships happening in the image. These areas don't need a lot of details, just a few hints of repetition and textures is enough. So at this stage, we begin to polish some selected areas. You might want to pick the focal zone, typically the castle and the immediate field around it, and increase the definition there a little bit. Sharpen edges slightly, maybe add a few small highlights to create some extra contrast. You want to keep the surrounding areas softer to preserve depth. If your plan is to include a character, you can draft maybe a small silhouette near the entrance or at the foreground. Might help with storytelling a little bit. So you want to work systematically through all the areas, value first and then color, and then figure out the texture. Strong value structure will carry through color shifts without losing any readability, so it's really important to nail it first. So you might also consider some rhythm here and there. You can repeat some shapes or colors throughout your composition. For example, maybe the color of the roof can be repeated in some other area. I took, for example, this yellowish ground and placed it also in the background to connect the whole region. Again, in order to achieve the depth, you might want to add some subtle atmospheric layers. Where necessary, low haze along the ground can help separate the foreground rows from the middle ground. For the background, you can use a very thin aerial perspective for the distant hilltops. And of course, you have to use soft brushes and low opacity for these layers. Let's refine the vegetation that touches the castle walls. We can let some leaves overlap edges and cast small shadows to integrate the plants physically with the structure. This whole interaction will read more convincingly the more thought you put into describing the form around the castle and around its vegetation. Also, don't forget to address any distracting details. Of course, there might be a texture or a highlight that pulls the attention away from the focal area, so you have to either mute it or soften the edges or decrease or increase the light to make sure that nothing is too distracting. The most important is that every detail is supporting the composition and the focal point you established in the beginning. In order to see it more clear, you want to sometimes step back or zoom out of the whole image, have a look at it, see if everything is consistent, the level of details, the composition, the black and white value structure. All of these things are really important and you have to nail them before committing to smaller details. So at this stage, what else can you do? You might want to perform like a color adjustment, so you can put a color adjustment layer on top and make sure that you unify the temperature maybe a little bit. Like a gentle overall grade can maybe tighten the palette and improve the overall quality. You want to look at the whole image again and maybe a few crisp strokes on the entrance, some maybe refined shadow edges here and there, and maybe a few highlights can tighten the read and improve the image as the last step. And of course, you don't want to be like super tight and tense everywhere. You might want to keep the canvas less detailed, have some breathing space here and there. You might want to finish by checking for edge variety and lost edges. Intentionally lose some edges in the shadow junctions to kind of allow the eye to rest. Use sharper edges sparingly, but very effective to kind of direct the attention. So when you think that your statement is done, everything reads clearly and the composition feels stable, consider the painting complete. You can always come later and maybe recognize some things. So let's have a look at the final image. I spent just a little bit of time to push the contrast in some areas. I also figured I should remove some of the darker marks on the buildings, like some extra windows, so I just took them out as a last step. I also added a little bit of information to the lavender field by pointing out that there are some planes that are turned away from the light, like vertical ones. This really helps with understanding the space a little bit better. I also added some information to the trees around the castle, and that's pretty much it. Thanks so much for following along. I hope you enjoyed the process, and if you did, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps a lot. Thanks again for watching till the end, and I hope to see you in the next one coming soon.